Hi folks, this is Anastasia with the USAID. This is the Donor Committee for Enterprise Development webinar on gender and the business environment. We're going to get started in just 1 minute as folks trickle in. All right, folks, hello again. For those who just joined, this is the Donor Committee for Enterprise Development webinar series, and today's webinar is focused on gender and the business environment. The DCED is a donor platform for coordination, and we've been putting on a series of webinars on different topics. Today we have two great presenters who are going to talk about the World Bank's recent Women, Business, and the Law report, the 2020 edition. And my USAID colleague is also going to talk about how our work has strengthened women's property rights. So I'll just quickly introduce our speakers today. Taya Trumbic, I hope I got that right, is a program manager for Women, Business, and the Law and the Global Indicators Group at the World Bank. She has worked on various aspects of government reform and job creation for more than 12 years since joining the bank in 2006. And previously, she also worked at the Ministry of Finance for the Republic of Croatia and the IMF. Our second speaker is my colleague, Ioana Bouvier, a senior geospatial advisor in the Land and Urban Office, where she focuses on building capacity to leverage data, geospatial analysis, and sustainable technology to advance land and resources governance and support resilient communities. So, just a few housekeeping things. I hope that folks are able to see the slides and hear us okay. I think that in the invitation, there's also, in case your bandwidth is problematic, we also have a call-in option, and I actually see that we have several folks who are just calling in. And if you have any questions throughout the webinar, please feel free to type them in the public chat box towards the bottom on the right-hand side, and I will be taking note of the questions and collecting them for discussion at the end. So without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Taya.
Good morning, everyone. I'm actually interested to see how the chat function works. So I wanted to see and start us off with the question this morning. If you can type it in, and I'd like to see if you could answer the question, how many countries have achieved gender equality as of today? Your best guess. And I just wanted to see if the chat function works. If not, okay, so I see someone said 6, 3, 15. Oh, this is so much fun to see this live answers. Well, I'm sorry to disappoint you, but the answer is 0. There are 0 countries that have achieved gender equality. Women are still behind in all aspects. And what I'll focus on today is economic opportunities for women and how the government can help by changing their laws. I'll turn off my video for now so that you can see the slides better. The good news is that we know more today about the importance of equality of opportunity than we used to. We have more data and more evidence that helps us build that case. And we know that this is important. Equality between men and women in the law is important, not only because it's a human rights issue and women are humans who deserve this equal rights, but now we also know that there are economic benefits for society as a whole when more women work, when they're entrepreneurs and they're able to contribute fully. But countries cannot achieve their full potential if half of their population cannot participate fully. Governments can do something about this, though, because they are the ones who put forward laws and implement them, and that's what we'll talk about today. So I'm going to share with you the results of the World Bank's latest Women, Business and the Law 2020 report. It can really be used, this report we hope can be used as a tool for governments, not only to understand what laws exist in their books and how they might impact women's economic empowerment in their countries, but also to be inspired by what other countries around the world and maybe in their neighborhood are doing, and we can learn from these experiences. So I hope that this presentation gives you a good understanding of the problems we are facing and the urgency that we have to change these laws, but also to understand what can be done to overcome these barriers. These discriminatory laws need to change, and they need to change around the world. It's the only way we can achieve our development goals, and this is why the World Bank is investing in this report. So just to introduce to you, I don't know how many of you are aware of the Women, Business and the Law Index. It has gone through a little bit of a restructuring over the last couple of years. The report itself has been producing data and reports for almost 11 years now. But in the last 2 years, we have aggregated that into an index, and we have narrowed it down to 35 questions that were identified to have the biggest impact on outcomes we'd like to influence when we look at women's economic opportunities. And then these 35 questions have been separated into 8 indicators that follow the major decisions that women go through as they enter and work through their working life. We have found that this data is, can be used to showcase not only the progress countries have made, but also what still remains to be done. The current database covers 190 economies. I know someone had sent a question earlier about Somalia. We have added Somalia for the first time to our database. And we have also reconstructed the index going back all the way to 1970 so that we can really see the progress that has been made over the last 50 years. And having this much data allows us to do some more economic analysis and show really that what this means for outcomes for women. And so there's a recent research that's been written by Penny Goldberg, our chief economist of the World Bank, Simeon Jankov, and one of our team members, Marie Highland, that shows the evidence that better performance on this index is associated with more women in the labor force. It's associated with lower wage gap between men and women and improved development outcomes overall. And this is really groundbreaking for us to be able to really show that these laws do matter. They matter for women and they matter for economies as a whole. So where do we stand today? This is the results of our latest study. And you see here the global scores around the world. Darker colors indicate countries that have higher scores, meaning that their laws are more equal and treat men and women more equally when it comes to these areas of economic opportunity. The average score is 75.2, which means that women have an average 3/4 of the rights that men have. And you see that the darker colors are concentrated in certain areas of the world, so the regions are not performing equally here. We see a lot of the better laws in Europe, North America, United States, Canada, Australia, the high-income countries, but other regions are catching up. We see Latin America, Eastern Europe. The regions that are still lagging the most behind are in Middle East, Sub-Saharan Africa, North Africa, and South Asia. We have, I asked earlier how many countries have achieved gender equality, and that answer is 0, but on our index, we do have 8 countries as of today that score 100, which means that in those 35 questions that we look at, they have those good practices. But 10 years ago, when this project started, none of these economies, and actually no country in the world, would have scored 100. And we see that countries have gradually gotten there, with Canada being the recent addition with the new parental law that introduced more paternity leave. And I'll talk about that a little bit more. And I just wanted to go through some of the results from our recent research. The good news is that countries are reforming, and reform is happening where it's the most needed. And it's happening in the indicators that are also lagging behind and in the regions that are lagging behind. So the Parenthood Indicator is the one that looks at maternity leave, paternity leave, parental leave, and the protection for women from dismissal when they're pregnant. And we have seen that this is the indicator that is still lagging behind the most. More than half of the countries of the 190 that we measure don't have the good practices that we've identified. And here I'm just showing the average for maternity leave and paternity leave in the countries that have them. You see for paternity leave, even though we have more and more countries introducing this, the average is just 5 days. That's just 1 week off for fathers when they have a new child. Another indicator that's really lagging behind is related to pay. And this is the indicator that looks at job restrictions for women and protections such as equal remuneration for work of equal value. And we still see 90 countries around the world that forbid women performing certain tasks. And I'm showing here some examples that we found interesting in different industries, and how many countries within these industries restrict women from certain work, working in underground mines, driving railway, metro, trains in Azerbaijan. These might seem strange jobs, but what we're looking at here is not whether they're dangerous or somehow not good jobs. We're looking at whether men and women can work in them in the same way. So if it's a dangerous job, why is it more dangerous for women than a man? And this is one of the reasons what women are restricted from sectors like construction and mining and energy. They're restricted from better paying jobs. And this is why it falls under the pay indicator in our index. Another really important area of the law to focus on is sexual harassment protection in the workplace. And this is becoming more and more, women are more and more vocal about this, but we still see that there are 50 countries around the world that do not protect women from sexual harassment in employment. And this impacts not only the physical and psychological health of the workers, but it also leads to higher employer turnover and increased absenteeism. So we have also seen some recent studies that associated with decreased productivity and profits for companies and overall lower female labor force participation. So it's really important for women to feel safe at work, to be able to fully participate. And it's an extremely important area to encourage governments to change, because the law can send a clear message that such behavior is not acceptable, and it can encourage more victims to come forward. We still see 36 countries around the world where women cannot apply for a passport in the same way as men. And this really has an impact on women's ability to fully participate, to travel around the world. There are 9 countries that still women cannot travel without the permission of their husband. And we know that from our research and evidence that we've collected, that freedom of movement is a strong predictor of female labor force participation, female entrepreneurship, and women's financial inclusion. So gender gaps in account ownership and capacity to borrow from financial institutions are higher in countries that have more freedom of movement for women. The good news is that more and more countries are changing these laws, so we see this number going down every year, and we hope that it will get to 0 soon. I also wanted to talk about our indicator on assets, because I know that's something Ioana will refer to later. We know that strong property rights are important for women. Ownership of property, physical property, is important for collateral and access to finance. And it's one of the hardest areas to change. We have seen a lot of change in this space, just not very recently. And we still have 44 countries around the world where male and female surviving spouses do not have equal rights to inherit. This remains one of the hardest areas to reform and one of the most important. What's encouraging is that we are seeing governments paying more and more attention to these laws. So over the last 2 years, since the last report came out, we saw 40 countries implement 62 reforms. And the reforms were concentrated in the regions where they're most needed. In the Middle East and North Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, and South Asia, there's still room to improve this more. These 10 countries are the ones that have done the most, that have had the biggest improvement in their index over the last 2 years. We see Saudi Arabia there at the top with really an incredible increase. They've changed laws across 6 indicators. United Arab Emirates has changed laws across 5 indicators. We haven't seen this much change happening in this region recently. So 6 of the top improvers are from the Middle East and North Africa: Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Djibouti, Jordan, and Tunisia. We also see 3 from Sub-Saharan Africa: South Sudan, Sao Tome and Principe, and the Democratic Republic of Congo, and 1 from South Asia, Nepal, and had the 3rd biggest improvement. These are, of course, the regions that are lagging behind the most, so they have the most to improve. But we see governments paying more and more attention to how they could bring in more women into the labor force. And especially in the Middle East and North Africa, governments are starting to recognize that they need to diversify their economies, and they cannot do it. They cannot achieve the economic growth that they need without half of their population being able to participate more fully. In Africa, some of these countries that we see here, countries are updating old legacy laws from the 1950s and 1960s, and they're using this opportunity to just start from scratch and introduce completely new labor codes, which have a lot of the good practices that we encourage. I'll talk a little bit more about all the different reforms that countries have done, but we have seen this incredible movement from Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates in, reforming across many areas at the same time. Djibouti, Morocco, and Tunisia introduced domestic violence legislation, which is extremely important. And you can go to our website, wbl.worldbank.org, to see all the different reforms, these 62 different reforms that we recorded, and understand what countries have done to get there. As I mentioned, there are certain areas of the law that need more reform than others, that more countries are lagging behind. And those were the ones related to parenthood and to pay. But we have seen that this is the area of the most reform. So we saw 16 countries introduce reforms in the last 2 years, which either mandated maternity leave, increased maternity leave, or introduced paternity or parental leave, or forbid dismissal for pregnant women. And every region, in fact, introduced at least one reform except Latin America. We also see countries that are performing well already overall, such as Canada and the US, introducing these type of reforms. So that's encouraging. 12 economies also removed restrictions on the industries, jobs, and hours that women can work. The United Arab Emirates, one of the top improvers, for example, removed all job restrictions based on gender, making it easier for women to enter the workforce. South Sudan and South Tome adopted new labor codes, which have no restrictions on women working in any industry or any task. And Jordan also reformed its labor code to remove restrictions on women working at night. Nepal also lifted restrictions on women working at night and mandated equal remuneration for work of equal value. So we're really encouraged to see these reforms, and we hope that we can see more of them in the future. Women have to feel safe both at home and at work to be fully able to participate. And we see the 10 economies reformed laws to introduce protections against sexual harassment and domestic violence just in these last 2 years. And this is over the last, if we look at over the last 10 years that the report has been collecting data, this is the area that has had a lot of pickup recently. And I just wanted to mention that there's only one country that changed in the area of assets. As I said, it's one of the most difficult areas to change, and this is Cote d'Ivoire. They reformed their marriage law, and it took out some discriminatory provisions, and now spouses have equal rights to manage and dispose of marital property. But in other countries, these inequalities still persist, and they have very important impact on women's ability to participate fully and become entrepreneurs. I just wanted to sort of leave you with this image. This is our latest research looking back to 1970 and how laws have changed around the world. A lot more details about this, but we're looking here at the regional averages, and you see that there is a trend upwards. So countries all over the world have been improving, but at varying speeds. And so we see Sub-Saharan Africa having a huge increase over time. We see Middle East and North Africa sort of more or less a slower pace, but picking up towards the end. And what's really interesting is that this change, to me, is that it's just not happening fast enough. So it took 50 years to get from an average of about 50, so about half of the rights that men have that women had on average in the law, to 75. So it would take another 50 years to get to full equality in the law. And that's just too long. We need this to happen faster, and we need to change these laws now that we know what we need to do. So I wanted to leave you with our website. You can go there and help us download the report, look at the data for your country, help us spread this message and build awareness of what needs to be done. We are also right now doing a social media campaign where we want to hear from women around the world what it is like to work as a woman when they compare themselves to men in their country today. What was it like for their mothers or grandmothers? How has it changed over the last 50 years, and what needs to change so that our daughters have better opportunities in the future? Thank you.
Specifically on women's land rights. And I want to start by kind of framing the challenge, because insecure land, what do insecure land rights for women mean? That means that women's economic opportunities are very limited, because especially in rural areas, land is the only asset that women have, as well as men. And so insecure land rights for women limit the opportunities for women to access finance. As you heard from Thea, they limit their opportunities to use their land for agricultural productivity, to make investments, to attract investments. And so really strengthening women's land rights is a key part of improving the enabling conditions for women's economic empowerment. And I'm also going to give you a few examples of approaches that can be used to strengthen women's land rights. So with that, I want to move to some statistics again, looking at the global status of women's land rights. And you heard from Thea about equality in ownership, and you heard about some improvement. Well, this from the same report, the World Bank 2019 Women, Business and the Law report, we learned that 75 countries have at least one constraint with regarding to women's property rights. So again, a very high number, 75 countries put some kind of constraint on women's property rights. And again, globally, the status of women's land rights, globally, women own or control, are less likely to control land than men. And importantly, even when they do own land, that land tends to be of lower quality, and they do overall, women control less amount of land. So those are important statistics to kind of frame the challenge of insecure women's land rights and the importance of strengthening women's land rights. So I know there was a question about what are the practical experiences in terms of identifying and changing legislation and official procedures, legislation such as you heard about the spouse having joint ownership. I want to emphasize that there's a distinction between the legal framework of formal equality, which you have heard about some improvements globally, and those are very important and difficult to advance. But there's also, besides the legal framework, there's the reality on the ground. In essence, the legal framework, the formal equality, the fact that it's stipulated, the laws on the books stipulate that women do have the legal right to own, inherit, or sell land, are necessary, however, are not sufficient, because in reality, customary or cultural norms may prevent women from accessing their legal rights, essentially, to land. So that's very important because it's not sufficient to just identify and make improvements on the legal framework. There has to be also a change, sometimes in customary norms, in the power dynamics on the ground. So I just want to emphasize that, because I know there was a question about how donors have worked on identifying discriminatory practices or the legal framework that can be changed. That's very, very important. It's not sufficient. There are also customary cultural norms that have to be changed in order for women to really have access to land and to strengthen their land rights. So I want to move on a little bit to the importance of women's land rights in their economic empowerment and in creating new economic opportunities for women. And I want to start by emphasizing that in recognition of the key role that women's property rights play in an enabling condition for women's economic empowerment, this is a key priority for the US government. So supporting women's property rights, as well as lifting restrictions on women possessing and managing property, these are key priorities that are supported by the US government. So I want to emphasize that. And regarding the economic benefits related to women's having secure rights to their land as a key asset, I mentioned that in rural areas, in agriculture, and where agriculture is the only livelihood for a household, strengthening women's land rights is very important, because that is their key to prosperity, in a way, to improving agriculture productivity. They need to have secure rights to land to do that. To sell their land, they need to have secure rights to be able to sell their land. And they make up over 40% of the labor force in agriculture. So a key part of the labor force does not have secure rights to land. That limits their economic power. Importantly, there's evidence also that when women do have access to the same amount of land, the productivity, the crop yield increases. So that's also very important in terms of improving, strengthening women's economic opportunities. So a few examples from the economic benefits. Again, this is coming from some of the statistics, and I'll refer to our lending site where you can find a lot more examples. But just to give you an example, from Ethiopia and Nepal, food security improvements when related to households where women own land. So in Nepal, we have an example related to children's food security. They're less likely to be severely underweight. In Ethiopia, similarly. The important nutrition findings related to strengthening women's land rights. And in Tanzania, specifically, and you'll see more examples from Tanzania, when women have strong land rights, they're 3 times more likely to have higher earnings, to improve their incomes. So very important findings related to women's land rights and economic benefits. So I want to move on to what can be done. What are some of the strategies and approaches to strengthening women's land rights? So I mentioned that it's not sufficient to work on the legal framework. It's very important, it's necessary. It's not sufficient because there are local customary power dynamics, cultural norms that need to be addressed. So strategies really need to find the right balance between, in essence, relocating rights and resources to increase gender equality, to increase women's access to land without undermining the local power dynamic, without undermining the local customary norms in a way. So it's very important to do so gradually and to increase awareness and to engage the entire community in the process of changing culture norm, of realizing why gender equality is important, why there are economic benefits to the entire community, not just women. We saw also importance of food security when women in a household have access to land. So in terms of strategies to address this issue of unequal access to land for women and seeking to strengthen women's land rights, a gender analysis is essential. And as part of that gender analysis, there could be, because again, there was a question about how to identify discriminatory practices or how to improve the legal framework specific to women's property rights. A gender analysis could point to such discriminatory practices, to how the legal framework could be improved, as well as who in a community can be down to a community or a regional level to identify who has access to land, what are the traditional norms in terms of allocating land, who has the power of decision making, very important, because those are going to be key actors that have to be involved in the process. Without the entire community on board, real gender equality cannot be attained. It's very, very important to engage the entire community. So a careful gender analysis would seek to identify the legal framework as well as the local norms and the distribution of resources, because there may be limited resources available when resources are constrained. That also has an influence on gender equality with respect to women's property rights. So essentially, a gender analysis would look at whether there's a difference in how men and women access land. So with that, I want to move to some of the examples and approaches that can be used to strengthen women's land rights. And I mentioned that it's very important to engage the community. One approach that USAID has tested and scaled successfully is called MAST. It stands for Mobile Applications to Secure Tenure. And it combines participatory methods. It combines mapping and best practices for technology tools with community engagement. So it seeks to engage the entire community, women and men, youth, the elderly, to increase awareness, but also to document how resources are distributed in essence. So it is a very transparent process that seeks to be sustainable and to engage the community in the process of documenting land and resources rights. So what is it? So it engages the community in a clarification and documentation of community and land rights. That is very important because the legal framework, the laws on the books may be there. However, without understanding what is the actual distribution of resources on the ground, what are the local norms? Are there any seasonal differences? Are there any differences between men and women in how they access land? Without understanding that, essentially mapping and documenting and getting the community to vet, to validate that distribution of resources, there cannot be a clear understanding of how women access resources. So the approach is a bottom-up approach, it's a participatory approach that promotes local self-reliance, and it's really geared at improving transparency around the resource allocation primarily, and also reducing cost to documentation. That's very important. It's also very important that it's geared at reducing disputes, because improved transparency and gradually introducing the process of documenting land and resource rights can help. It's been proven that it helps to reduce disputes, because in that process, there is a community discussion, there is a validation process where the community has a chance to discuss essentially these disputes. And a lot of the disputes we find at the community level are family related or neighbor disputes that can be relatively easily resolved. Of course, there are always more complicated disputes that may not be resolved. But the relatively small disputes between neighbors or family members can usually be resolved relatively quickly through a participatory, transparent process. There's a real gap in respect to land documentation for smallholders, small farmers, where to access tools and to really have a documentation, a way to show what assets they have access to. Farmers usually have to go through lots of steps. It tends to be expensive. It tends to be a long-term process. It's not easily accessible. So really, the approach seeks to fill that gap, to fill the need for land documentation, and importantly, to empower women and vulnerable groups in the community, because it is an all-inclusive community process. It involves several steps during which there has to be agreement within the community with respect to the distribution of land rights and to how community members can access. So it seeks to improve land governance in a community through this empowerment process, training, we call community members, which are women and youth as well, people that don't usually have a voice in the land and resource allocation at the local level. So a few words about findings so far, and I'm going to refer specifically to Tanzania, where the approach was first tested and it is being scaled up across 2 districts. And using the approach so far, over 60,000 parcels were documented across 2 districts. And importantly, there are significant efficiency gains over time. And other findings, such as very low rate of disputes within the communities where the approach was used to document land rights, to essentially obtain a customary rights of occupancy, a documentation certificate in Tanzania that allows a farmer to prove they have access to a parcel, essentially to a parcel of land. And that's a document that can be used to put together a business plan, for example, to attract an investment, to even apply for a loan that is starting as well. So it is seen as a key step to economic empowerment. And more findings this time from Zambia, an example from Zambia where the approach was also used. In Zambia, the situation is somewhat different. The approach was not used to document legal rights because there is no legal documentation of customary rights in Zambia as compared to Tanzania. However, just to give you an idea about the findings, and there's a lot of evidence about the use of these participatory approaches on the ground. But on the left, you have essentially a perception of tenure security. What is the livelihood of the power elites or the chief or other actors essentially encroaching on your land? So that was the question. And you can see it's about between 10 and 15% overall. After the use of the approach, again, in the communities where the approach was used to document land and resource rights, that perception has dropped significantly, and it is under 5%. It was under 5% at the time of the endmine. So after the use of the approach, essentially members of the communities felt that there's less of a likelihood of encroachment on their land rights. So important finding. And I won't insist on too much on the cost, but I mentioned improve efficiencies. Those are important because if accessing documentation or if seeking to verify your land rights within a community and with a government officials, if that is very costly and time intensive, that is a significant barrier to women in accessing essentially documentation. So just to give you an example, and there are lots of numbers on this slide, but in Tanzania, where the approach was tested, the average cost to document a parcel was around $40 US. And after in the communities where the approach was used, it is currently under $8 per parcel. And also there's important time efficiencies as well. So it is essentially, it's an approach that has allowed community members to document their land and resources a lot faster and at less cost. And I want to sort of reach a conclusion of the presentation with another key finding from Tanzania that refers specifically to strengthening women's land rights. And on the left, you have a statistic of 27%. So under overall, on average in Tanzania, the women's participation in land ownership was under 30%, so around 27% before the start of this approach. And with the approach in targeted communities, the rate of participation in land ownership by women specifically, so women landholders represented 45%. It's actually higher right now. It's closer to 50%. So very important finding from the use of the approach in Tanzania, that it has been effective in essentially promoting women's empowerment. And I want to conclude with, again, the key message that women's land rights are a key enabling condition to empower women economically. And that there are approaches that have to carefully consider both the legal framework and the local customary norms. But there are approaches that could effectively strengthen women's land rights. And that is a key US government priority, and it is a key priority for development activities. And with that, I also want to point to our website, landlinks.org, where you can find a lot of information about not just the use of the approach, but specific to women's economic empowerment and the role of women's land rights as one of the key enabling conditions. So with that, I want to thank you very much and turn it over to the questions and answers session. Thank you.
There's a question about Rwanda. Is Rwanda really standing out for their reforms? And could you explain again what was the reform in Cote d'Ivoire to improve property rights and equality?
Your microphone was muted for the first part of the Anastasia, so you might need to repeat the question, if that's okay, please. Anastasia, are you able to please repeat the question?
Increase in women business in the law 2020 that have a perfect score of 100, but then you said that 0 countries have perfectly equal rights. There's a question about Rwanda. And also, could you explain the reform in Cote d'Ivoire again?
Yeah. Okay, so I've heard the question about the 100 versus 0, Rwanda and Cote d'Ivoire. That's the part that I heard. If there's something that you said before that, maybe you can add it next time we go around. So just to clarify, and I hope everyone can hear me now.
Yes.
It was exactly the point that Ioana had made also, that laws are a necessary step. We think it should be the first step, but it's not sufficient. So there are 8 countries today that have 100 on our index, meaning that they have implemented all the good practices that we have identified in those 35 questions in the law. But in practice, this is still not in the outcomes that we look at. Women are still underrepresented in parliaments, in decision, as presidents, ministers. When you look at CEOs of companies, when you look at how much they make, we still are not equal in those aspects. And that's what I meant, is that there's still a lot to do once the law is equal, but let's get to at least that part first. That was that first point. And when we look at even as recently as 10 years ago, no country in the world even had the laws equal. So that was just a point to say it's not easy to change laws, but when you change them, it's a good opportunity to then discuss the implementation and what happens once the law is there, what needs to happen next. And that's something we'd really like to look into in the future. Regarding Rwanda, there has been a lot of reform in Rwanda in this area, and they are improving over time. Their score is more than the global average and more than the Africa average, but there's still a lot of room to improve there. But we have seen several countries in Africa, including Rwanda and Kenya, that have introduced equality provisions in the constitution. And once that happened, then we see it trickling down into legislation, and specific laws are changing to be able to conform to that. But just having that provision in the constitution is still not enough if the laws, the lower level laws, still have these discriminatory practices. And then regarding Cote d'Ivoire, that's also a country that has really over time been wanting to introduce gender equality in the law. They've been doing it through different legislation, and they have introduced that. It was just this past July, a reform to the marriage law, and that reformed the way that women inherit property, the way they can manage it when they're married, and gave full equality to men and women when they're married to manage, own their property, and inherit it. So that was the reform in Cote d'Ivoire. And again, it's just in the law, so customary practices and the implementation of this is still something that needs to be worked on. But thank you for those very good questions.
Great, thank you. I'm just leaving my microphone on, so I hope that problem doesn't happen again. Thank you again, Taya. So for both of our speakers, property rights specifically, do you think that this is really the hardest category to change? For example, in terms of property rights or really any other area, my personal question is, are the men really convinced that they're not losing out? And could you also contrast maybe any specific areas within property rights or some completely different area? Are there some reforms that have more immediate effect than others, given that there is a whole spectrum of steps that need to happen between legal passage and real implementation on the ground? So maybe I'll let Ioana go first this time.
Okay.
The implementation on the ground, as was emphasized earlier.
Ioana, we didn't hear the first part of your message. It takes a few minutes for the
unmute
to kick in.
It's very slow.
So if you could start again.
Okay. Is this good now?
Yes, I'm also leaving it on. I'm not turning it off.
Sure. So the short answer would be that it takes time, indeed, as they emphasize as well. It is not a simple process. It is complex, especially the changing norms. But when done gradually and carefully, it can be quite effective at changing local norms. And it goes back to proving and gaining the trust. I believe that trust is very important. And that's why participatory, very careful, gradual approaches are essential, so that for example, men that may have control more of the land can see the benefits of their spouses, for example, or their daughters having use of the land and having documented rights over the land, for example. I think it's really important to emphasize that it does take time, but it is possible. It is an opportunity and we have seen evidence that strengthening land rights for women specifically means, in essence, strengthening land rights for the entire community, and it is possible. Again, because it is a complex issue at the local level, it involves really a careful understanding of the context. That is why we found that bottom-up approaches, very participatory approaches, can help over time, as long as there is trust and continuity. I do want to emphasize that, of course, there has to be a link to economic benefits as well, so to livelihoods. And so it's not perhaps enough to just speak about the approach, but also about the linkages to economic development activities. For example, if there are projects or if the government is planning to implement a land reform or is working on improving land rights, that also can be connected to development activities in an area of investment, or improving or decreasing, for example, interest rates for smallholder farmers. That could be key. I also want to mention that the use of land does not have to be as collateral, but it can be a part of essentially a business package that improves the economic competitiveness of farmers, because farmers can show that they have access to a key asset, land, a parcel of land or several, or they can come together as well to essentially put together a business plan. So I think the economic opportunities are very important as well in gaining trust. It's not just the fact that it's not just increasing awareness, but it's also the fact that farmers have to see that there are real, tangible economic benefits to improving land rights for everyone, and especially women in this case.
Great, and Thea?
Yes, I wanted to say, changing property laws is difficult because if we just think about the history of humankind, how many people have lost their lives over land. I mean, land is something that is so precious to everyone, and it's really difficult when those rights get taken away from one group or another. It can cause a lot of social unrest, and so that's why I think anything that deals with how property passes hands or is inherited is controversial and difficult for governments. Many governments in the world, they only have 4 or 5 years in office, and they need to think, what are they going to spend their political capital and what's going to get them reelected? So often issues around gender equality are very controversial, and governments don't want to take up that precious space that they have on these issues. And so it's really important, I think, to amplify this message that, this is a way to gain recognition of doing something that's good for your entire country and that gets you recognized globally. And we hope that more governments are willing to take those risks.
Great.
And, yeah.
That's a very important point. And I want to, speaking of risk, I want to turn to a question that I think applies actually to both of you, because you both mentioned the potential of using land or other kinds of property for collateral, or not necessarily as collateral, but in some ways it actually makes it more likely that the woman or the family, whoever the owner, will apply for a loan. So can you clarify what mechanism, how that happens? Do they necessarily use it as collateral? And in terms of borrowing, are there any risks to the woman for doing that? And maybe Taya can go first.
Mm-hmm. Yes, well, we just know from research and other stories around that when women have access to property, they have better access to financial resources as well. I can't really comment to whether they then must use it or not, but I know that just the same as when you own your house or you're renting it, you invest more when you own something. And so if you are an entrepreneur or a farmer and you own your property, you're more likely to invest in fertilizer and seed and the right products to make your farm more productive. If you know that 2, 3, 5, 10 years down the line, you still own that land and you'll be able to then reap the benefits. If you're just renting and you could be kicked out any moment, you're not willing to make those investments, and so that impacts your overall profitability over time. And I think in the areas that we look at, we don't really look at the risks to the women over borrowing, but maybe Ioana could talk more about that.
I don't know if you muted yourself.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Yes, we can hear you.
I think there's just a delay in connection. So with respect to using the land as collateral, that is a very good question, and I want to address it by saying that in a way, the use of land as documentation, it could decrease the risk as well, specifically to women farmers.
We just lost you there, Ioana. Oh, this is too bad. Maybe while we're waiting for her to come back, Taya, I have a question for you. Mm-hmm. What's your experience in helping governments reform? And specifically, my colleague who came from Vietnam, he was commenting about 77 prohibited occupations for women, and he's not sure if they've finally changed them. But do you have any experience you can share about the occupational restrictions?
Yeah, so we, first of all, I think building awareness again is a big thing. Sometimes we've discussed, now that we have an index, it's a little bit more sensitive, and we've discussed with a few governments why they score, 55, for example, and often they don't recognize that they still have some laws in the books. So these could be old laws that have existed for years and are not actually being used. And so I think just working with governments, I think we've realized that it is helpful for them to understand what laws need to be changed and how other countries are doing that. And so I think they are looking for examples of, oh, this country did it this way, they passed a decree, or this one changed a law or introduced a completely new law. So we are learning in this space still. Vietnam, I don't think they've removed all the restrictions yet. And, there were, historically, there were a lot of these discriminatory practices related to certain occupations, but they were thought of as protections for women. So we wanted to protect women from particularly difficult jobs that might impact their productivity or their fertility. And so I think we've learned over time that actually prevents them from participating fully, and that there are other ways to protect them in the workplace by ensuring there are certain safe conditions at work. And so we are seeing countries, some are just repealing completely these laws and just having no restrictions at all, and then introducing some safety measures, and others are reducing the restrictions over time. And so we have seen countries that have these, hundreds of different jobs that women can't do, are slowly reducing them in certain sectors. And then it's sort of a slower paced over time reform. But nothing makes these jobs mandatory for women. They're just not restricted from them. And so it's their choice whether they want to do this work or not.
Great, thank you. And everyone else seems to be able to hear Ioana. So Ioana, can I turn it back to you? And also you have 1 minute to make any last comments. Sorry.
Yes, absolutely. Can you hear me now, Anastasia?
Yes.
Great. So with respect to risks for women from using land as collateral, absolutely agree. That is a very good point. I want to emphasize that doesn't have to be the case.
Oh, no.
That doesn't necessarily have to be the case. We have seen examples that, it's still very early on, but we're seeing examples of groups of farmers or women's groups of farmers using the land to essentially make the business case to reduce the risk of investment rather than using as a collateral. So in a way, land is part of a package that shows an investor or a bank that it is a good investment. Access to this key asset, to this parcel of land or several parcels, and that strengthens the business case for an investment. So rather than using strictly, the simplified, using land as a collateral as part of a guarantee in a loan, rather it can be used to reduce the risk in investment. So that's a very important point, and really important for women who, to begin with, have access to less land and are at high risk.
That's a really important point, Ellen. Thank you. And I personally, I have worked on this topic as well. My view is that in the end, we want to give women the same information and power as men, but we want them to be able to make their own decisions about what risks they want to take, because a lot of times their alternatives are not that great either. And we need to be aware of that as well. So with that, I do want to respect everyone's time. We got a very interesting question at the last minute, and we haven't even answered everyone. So I will just have to refer you to the two websites, wbl.worldbank.org, and also USAID's website is landlinks.org. And we will send out the slides tomorrow to everyone who's participated. I will ask you again to please fill out the feedback form. Maybe Amy, if you could post it again, it'll take you 2 minutes, and it'll really help us plan future webinars that are useful for you. So thank you very much, and hope to see you next time.